Lebanon's interior minister has ordered the country's security forces to open a, quote, rapid and transparent inquiry after more than 130 people are reported injured in overnight violence in Beirut. Security forces fired rubber bullets, tear gas and used water cannons against anti-government demonstrators in the worst repression since protests broke out 2 months ago. Hours later, assailants set fire to the local offices of two major political parties, and another man was reported to have set himself alight in protest in the southern city of Sidon. While demonstrators have now returned to the streets ahead of Monday's talks between President Molana-Allen and different parliamentary blocs to name a new prime minister. Well, for the latest on all this, we can cross now to our Beirut correspondent, Molana-Allen. Hello, thank you for being with us. First, how do you explain this sudden escalation?
So the escalation came initially from the protesters in terms of the fact that they did something slightly different, and what they decided to do yesterday was they said, this is our parliament, the parliamentarians aren't using it, they're not doing anything to form a new government, so we're going to try and get in. Parliament Square, Nejma Square, which is just behind me, has been blocked off for more than 2 months since the protest started, and they decided they were going to try and get through those barriers. Now, it seems clear that the security forces had received some sort of directive that if protesters were to try and get into Parliamentary Square, that they were to use much greater force, and that's what they did. There weren't that many protesters last night, just a few hundred, but when they tried to get past those barriers, immediately rapid force was used, and we saw a lot of tear gas used. They have been using tear gas in recent weeks, but not on the level they did last night. And as you said, there rubber bullets and water cannon too, which has been very rare really since the first night of these protests. And of course, once that happened, what we then saw was protesters fighting back, which they also haven't been doing much, but a few of them have now started to say, if we see violence, if it's perpetrated against us, we're going to fight back. We saw protesters kicking cans of tear gas back at security officers. They were also being beaten with batons and fighting back against that too. And we then saw groups of Amal and Hezbollah supporters, the two main Shia groups here, come down and start fighting with protesters too. So that escalated the violence once again, and we saw security forces initially trying to separate them and then starting to fight with both sides, the protesters and the sectarian supporters. So things escalated for hours and hours last night. Many, many injuries, and not just the sort of light injuries we've been seeing in the last few weeks of protests, but the Lebanese Red Cross saying that almost half the people who were injured actually had to be taken to the hospital last night.
Now, despite the violence, as we can see behind you, people are back in the streets this Sunday. Are they at all hopeful ahead of tomorrow's meetings?
Yes, there have been variable reactions since the protest started to nights when there's been a slight escalation of violence. Some people were worried that today many people wouldn't turn out on the streets. Protesters were worried because people were scared of last night. That doesn't seem to be the case. As I said, just a few hundred protesters last night. Today we have seen several thousand going through the evening. They are uncowed. They're standing, crowding around the entrances to Parliament. Now, it seems tonight that the riot police are out in less force. The mood has been mostly peaceful. Lots and lots of angry chanting, but no real fighting. Just a few minutes ago, a couple of hundred young men, many with their faces covered, ran into the crowd. They were welcomed as they ran in there, and they started chanting again. But it is just groups of people tonight who seem quite cheerful about what they're doing and seem to just want to put across the point that we are still here and you can't scare us, which is what they say that riot police were trying to do last night. Now, what they're worried about, there are two possible outcomes tomorrow with these parliamentary consultations that the president is going to hold. The first one, of course, is that once again it's postponed. We have seen these repeatedly postponed as different people were thought to be nominated Prime Minister and pulled out at the last minute. So, of course, protesters will be furious if that happens once again, because it's now been nearly 2 months without a government since Prime Minister Saad Hariri resigned, and the country is foundering both economically and politically. The other option, which seems increasingly likely, is that Saad Hariri is going to be nominated once again as Prime Minister. Now, of course, protesters are absolutely furious about that possibility, because that was their greatest victory, was getting him to resign on the 29th of October, less than 2 weeks after the protests began. They say if that happens, nobody will have listened to them, and we will be going back to exactly the same status quo they were complaining about in the first place. So what remains to be seen tomorrow is whether there's anything new that Parliament has come up with, that the President, Molana-Allen, has come up with. It seems unlikely, but now even the one thing that parliamentarians could agree on, which was that Saad Hariri would be a good option, he too now is saying he's not sure he can lead a government, and other parties saying they're not entirely sure if they want him either. So tomorrow we suspect that there are going to be some quite large protests, whichever way those consultations go.
Molana-Allen, thank you very much for that update.